Just as we discussed yesterday, the negotiations between the United States and Iran are still facing serious obstacles. At this point, neither side can fully control the actions of their proxies, namely Israel and Hezbollah. Even though both sides recently agreed to a 2-week ceasefire, conflicts have already started to emerge. Iran claims that its 10-point proposal includes ending hostilities on all fronts, including in Lebanon, where Hezbollah operates with Iran's backing. However, the U.S. and Israel argue that the agreement applies only between the U.S. and Iran and has nothing to do with other regions or countries. As a result, Israel carried out heavy strikes in Lebanon yesterday, reportedly causing around 250 deaths. At this point, no one can clearly say who is right or wrong, because no one has actually seen the official 10-point document from Iran. And even if such a document appears, there's still the question of whether it's real or fake. Adding to the confusion, the U.S. Vice President stated that Iran has presented 3 different versions of its proposal. The first version was dismissed as nonsense, jokingly compared to something written by ChatGPT. The second version was considered more reasonable and is what Donald Trump reportedly used as a basis for negotiations. The third version contains entirely different demands and is circulating online. So which version is real? Media outlets opposing Trump, such as CNN and the New York Times, are focusing on the first and third versions, highlighting claims that Iran would be allowed to enrich uranium for nuclear weapons. They use this to criticize Trump, accusing him of weakness for potentially allowing such concessions. This has angered Trump, who responded by attacking those outlets, accusing them of fabricating a 10-point plan to undermine the negotiation process. He called it a complete hoax invented by political opponents. That's exactly why, up to now, no one can confidently say they've seen the real agreement. No one knows whether the ceasefire terms clearly include allies like Israel and Lebanon, or if they simply state a limited ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran. At this stage, everything comes down to logic rather than goodwill. If there were still trust, the two sides wouldn't have resorted to violence in the first place. So, if the agreement does not explicitly restrict Israel's actions in Lebanon, then Israel's attacks technically do not violate the U.S.-Iran ceasefire. And it's likely that this detail was never clearly written, otherwise, European countries wouldn't be calling for Lebanon to be included in the agreement. Of course, this is just logical reasoning. The only way to be certain is to see the official signed document. This situation highlights how difficult it is to resolve conflicts. Starting a war is easy, just one side needs to fire the first shot. But ending it is extremely complicated, because it involves the interests of many parties. For example, Iran supports multiple allied groups that regularly target Israel. From Israel's perspective, doing nothing means risking destruction, but responding militarily risks being accused of violating ceasefires. It's an almost impossible situation to fully resolve. The only theoretical solution would be a fundamental shift if Iran abandoned its hostility toward Israel and both sides chose cooperation instead. But realistically, that scenario belongs more in fiction than in real life. The root issue here is religion and ideology. And unlike economic interests, those are based on belief and identity, not right or wrong, making compromise far more difficult. At this point, the only clear way to end the conflict would be for one side to surrender, but that seems very unlikely. The U.S. refuses to allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, Iran has shown it can inflict damage even using relatively simple weapons to challenge advanced U.S. systems. So the question remains, when would either side be willing to back down? No one can answer that. For now, Trump continues to deploy forces around Iran, using a strategy of pressure, essentially forcing the opponent to negotiate under threat. He stated that U.S. warships, aircraft, troops, and additional weapons will remain positioned around Iran until any agreement is fully enforced. Iran has not officially responded yet, but it's clear they won't surrender easily. If they were going to give up, they would have done so earlier, after suffering major losses. At this stage, Iran likely sees little reason to back down. Instead, continuing the fight may give them leverage at the negotiating table. That's why many analysts believe the conflict is unlikely to end anytime soon. Even if the 2-week ceasefire holds, it may simply be a pause, a chance for both sides to regroup and prepare for further escalation. For the U.S., a prolonged conflict with Iran would be extremely costly. That's why they also need time to resupply from aircraft to carriers and even basic logistics for troops. After just over a month of fighting, U.S. soldiers have reportedly consumed millions of liters of coffee. Which raises a simple question. If that's just coffee, what about everything else needed to sustain a war?